Okay, so first, of course, I would like to thank the organizers of this conference for their invitation. Truly, not for fake, as Christian seemed to be pretending. And I am very happy to be taking part in the discussions today. So the session we are now beginning is entitled "Who is in charge of what and what for?" When Nicolas got in touch with me, he asked me to try and give some insight in the different types of interests that confront each other when programs aiming at internationalizing cities are implemented. More precisely, of course, to focus on programs aiming at putting cities on the map. To me, that is to say, at increasing their international visibility. So having all this in mind, I chose to focus on one type of strategy cities have become keen in developing. That is to say, a strategy we have mentioned a few times, we have been discussing a few times since this morning, networking. This is the reason why the general title, of this presentation is the following: Cities Targeting Internationalization Thanks to Networking. And more precisely, I have decided to present you the main results of a collective piece of research work done on one city network, more precisely on Eurocities. This study was conducted in the framework of a collective research project financed by the Rhône-Alpes region and in partner with Renaud Père and Sarah Rusey. Just in terms of methods, we gathered material in 3 different cities, Manchester, Lyon, and Brussels. And we based our investigation on direct observations of the Eurocities network meetings, on meetings with the Eurocities staff from Brussels, and to me and to us, most importantly, on archives and interviews gathered and conducted in Manchester and Lyon. Sorry, I'm not completely at ease with the laptop. So why focus on networks when studying internationalization? Maybe I could go through that slide a bit quickly because we mentioned, I think, part of these arguments a few times, but I think that the main idea here I want to underline is that within a very abundant literature written about city competition, a lot of authors or numerous studies connect the emergence of such rivalry to recent evolutions in capitalism. And considering the new connections between politics and the economy, cities are presented as compelled to acquire an international dimension by competing. Of course, this perspective is very stimulating, especially when pointing a trend towards convergence. But on the other hand, it often turns out into a kind of law of necessity that runs, at least to us, the risk of neglecting the role of local actors. Indeed, some local actors do get organized in order to obtain a particular international position and develop strategies, these strategies being successful or not. We, in this research, thus decided that we would focus on these internationalization strategies of cities as the product of interactions between local actors, them being private or public, although I have to admit that, like as it was pointed before, private actors haven't appeared as being very present, at least in the scenes we have been focusing on. So we're going to consider Lyon's and Manchester's roles as participatory actors in the city's network, Eurocities. And thus, we're going to perceive this network as a tool for internationalization, rather than as an objective sign of their internationalization, and even more, rather than a direct and inevitable consequence of economic globalization. The aim is clearly to highlight the role of local political strategies in the internationalization process of urban policies. The idea being that the black box that constitute networks is rarely open, when to us, even though cities claim that it is because they are international that they are part of Eurocities, we put it the other way and asserts that it is because they are part of the network that they are displayed as international, which makes an important difference. Now, why Eurocities and why Lyon and Manchester within Eurocities? The main thing to underline, I think, and to start with, is the fact that the Eurocities network holds regular meetings, notably its annual General Assembly. And when you go to these meetings, well, you come out with a dual impression. On the one hand, it is obvious that the people gathered, which are, maybe I should make it very clear, mainly municipal civil servants and municipal political leaders. So all these people gathered take for granted the existence of the European urban phenomenon, and applaud the existence of the Eurocities network, which they present as a way to federate numerous major European cities. And you can see that through different types of statements, and namely, they often turn towards the European Union and ask for more territorial dialogue and things like that. But things would perhaps be altogether a bit too simple if it only was about that. In fact, if you spend a little more time observing these annual General Assemblies, you note that the network is also based on sustained emulation and competition among cities that take part in it. So, for example, even though it might be a bit of an anecdote, they organize the granting of prizes and things like that. And more seriously, in the corridors, one can perceive city delegates discreetly distributing pamphlets about their action within the network. And in fact, these delegates appear to be on a campaign trail. They are trying to enable their city to enter the executive committee of the network and potentially help their mayor become president of Eurocities. So, is Eurocities a cardinal or an arena? Knowing that by cardinal we designate a structured horizontal cooperation among independent cities that work together in order to lobby the European institutions. And by arena, we refer to the stage that opponents compete on in most fighting games, okay? Well, of course, probably both, and that's what we're going to see thanks to Lyon's and Manchester's example. So to begin with, I will try to discuss the network as a cardinal, then the network as an arena, and in the conclusion, I'll try to go beyond the competition between cities and try to tackle the following question: can urban interests be represented? The network as a cardinal. This implies going back to the roots of the network and its genesis. It was set up in 1989, at least officially, mainly through the initiative of one city, that is to say Barcelona. Renaud Père mentioned it this morning. At that time, and from the very start, the idea was to structure a network that resembled clearly a political cardinal, as it was based on the implementation of horizontal cooperation between cities, as well as aiming at setting up an institution that would be recognized as representing the interests of European cities, notably by European institutions, of course. Barcelona's invitation in particular targeted second cities. That's very clear in the archives. But having said that, the issue of member cities was delicate from the start. At first, criteria were defined, and potential members had to be well, first in a small number, and they had to be non-capital cities. They had to show proof of real economic vitality, and they had to show proof of a genuine European reputation. Of course, as you may have guessed by hearing or listening to these criteria hardly remained objective, and they had long discussions over what a genuine European reputation was, for example. Furthermore, to be effective, the network rapidly started thinking as an interest group and needed to increase its numbers and continuously demonstrate its representativeness. So what happened in the end is that progressively the number of member cities increased. In 1989, the member cities decided, instead of keeping that number as small as possible, to let it grow, but to distinguish between founding cities and plain partner cities. Then, in 1999, they set up an executive committee, which at first, it then changed, but enabled the 6 founding cities to sit in this body, and also allowed those cities managing working groups to sit and make decisions. At that time also, they set up an office in Brussels and hired a general secretary. Now, over time, the structure of Eurocities evolved a lot, and in 2005, the network claimed to represent 450 million inhabitants across 120 metropolises from 25 different countries. So we're far from the 6 founding cities. And now it has 4 types of partners, but maybe I'll come back to that thanks to some questions. So to sum up the main idea of this first part, clearly grouping together major European cities in this way aimed above all at structuring a work capacity comparable to that of the European Commission. That was the target of the Eurocities network at that time. And indeed, several of the cities chose to get involved in this network because of the following objective, because of the lobbying objective, and if I have time, I can quote Richard Lees, who comes from Manchester. We joined Eurocities because we believed that there was a need for effective lobbying of the European institutions, then principally the Commission. We were more likely to have a lobbying power by doing a conjunction with those cities, so we joined and remained in membership, principally for the lobbying role that Eurocities play. Those cities who became involved in the initial Eurocities meetings were clearly seeking to gain access to the Commission. And if you look, I'm going to be very brief on that, but if you look at most European programs that were developed mainly in the 90s and early decade of 2000, Eurocities work did pay off, despite the crisis of 2008, but I have to say that very quickly. So maybe we could come back to that too. Now, the network as an arena. The network is not only an authority-turned coalition turned towards its Brussels office. It clearly also represents a step towards the internationalization of cities, and as such, it is a political arena in which member cities develop competitive positioning strategies linked, and that's what we find interesting, to their local institutional and political contexts. One way of illustrating this is the time they spent on progressively increasingly, defining increasingly specific rules concerning the conquest of reticular mandates, that is to say, mandates within the network itself. So, in the end, how and what for have Manchester and Lyon entered and then got involved in this competition? If you look at Manchester, it was mentioned a few times this morning, it was initially deindustrialization that led in Manchester, but also in Liverpool and Birmingham, some municipal representatives, British representatives, to adopt new economic strategies during the 1980s. What can be said to make things more precise here is that, first of all, they were in a very specific institutional context because they had, they were facing a very weak regional level of government in a context where the European Union was used to giving funding to that level of government. So they saw an opportunity there for them to say, okay, our regions can't do it. We cities will claim for European funding. Another important dimension is that it was for them clearly a way to put pressure on their national governments in order to make sure that their national governments wouldn't, which they actually did sometimes, keep some of the European money for themselves, linked to what I mentioned before, because there was no strong regional level. The national level of government had that, disturbing habit of keeping some of the European money. And last but not least, one common point between Liverpool, Birmingham and Manchester is the fact that they were governed by a stable Labour majority. It was mentioned about Manchester this morning. So they were in opposition in the opposition on the national stage, and at that time they attempted to propose a new way of thinking about economic development, trying to highlight the role of cities and trying to define what cities could do differently and better than the national government. So in the end, there are clear traces of the way local actors within Manchester tried to, strengthen this city's career within the Eurocities network, although I'm not going to go through all the steps of this career. In Lyon, we have a different context. It is primarily a political interest that actually led to the entry of Lyon into Eurocities. Mainly a change in the balance of power of local political families. At the end of the 80s, Michel Noir became mayor of Lyon and decided that he would distinguish himself from the former political leaders, especially on the theme of the internationalization of Lyon. And he pointed out the archaism of what had been done before, and he claimed that Lyon needed to, again, in order to distinguish himself from what had been done so far, he said, well, my solution is to enter European networks, especially Eurocities. When doing so, he also asked for some help from business leaders, notably Christian Boiron, who became his deputy mayor, and together they worked at making sure that Lyon would get involved in the city's networks. The Raymond Barre period, just to mention it, was a bit different because he became mayor after Michel Noir, and that's a period during which Lyon didn't disappear from cities' networks, but during that period, clearly the former prime minister, relied on his own person and his own networks in order to maintain Lyon's position at the on the international stage. Things changed again when Gérard Collomb came into power, so at the beginning of the year 2000s. And again, funnily enough, a bit like Michel Noir, although they don't belong to the same political party at all, he criticized the archaism of what Raymond Barre had been doing before, and he said, well, my solution is to get involved into European cities network, notably Eurocities. One last remark about this period. During the Raymond Barre period, there was also a very strong fight with Lille, because in fact, Lyon was still in Eurocities, but trying to get some responsibilities within some working groups, and Lille opposed that, so Lyon coming forward, and well, as far as we've been able to reconstruct the story, Lille opposed this move forward, this attempt from Lyon to move forward and gain power. Things changed in the year 2000. The Lyon team notably got involved and got the presidency of one working group that was very important at that time, EDUC, focusing on urban renovation. It was the first step of its move upwards within Eurocities. Then, even more importantly, it welcomed the General Assembly in 2002. So it was able to get involved in the political work within the network, and then it became it gained the vice presidency and automatically the presidency in 2006. It's an anecdote, but then Gérard Collomb succeeded to Richard Lees, so from Manchester. A few words of conclusion, maybe if I still have time. Can urban interests be represented? Eurocities clearly maintains, at least officially and in all its documents, that it is a cardinal representing urban interests in Brussels. But nevertheless, on the ground, the network clearly also functions as an umbrella for competing cities. So, in the end, if it is presented as a collective organization, the network is also a collection of cities in competition, even within the network. A great illustration of that is sometimes the connections and at other times the disconnections between the network's office in Brussels and the member cities, with a tendency, according to cities, for that office to gain too much autonomy and follow the aims of, for example, southern cities rather than northern cities, etc. I think that in the end, three constraints can be underlined that weaken the network's ability to improve, well, its definition as a cartel. First, its work at defining the network's borders. It is still not clear whose interests are represented by Eurocities, especially depending on the period, depending on who is president, depending on who sits on the executive committee. Second, the use of this internalized tools. So what do they do in their working groups? Do they focus on economic development and or European construction, which can be linked, of course, but sometimes they put more emphasis on European construction and other times on economic development, and maybe it goes back to the question Ivan raised this morning. And third, the competition between different levels of government, and of course, nation states play an important part here. Are they supporters or opposants to this network? If you look at the main program, the main, if not the only, but that's a discussion, proper European urban policy, which was called Urban. Well, France and England clearly opposed its development, and they played a major role in making sure that Urbact, which is, I think, just a shadow of what urban was before, even though the aims are a bit different, so maybe I'm being a bit too short there, while making sure that Urbact would remain a lot more under their control than under the Commission's control. I hope I wasn't too quick on some of the aspects. Thank you.